right, we're going to jump into chapter 8, and I'm going to address the fact that I'm wearing a red shirt already. You cannot yet holler, "Hey, Kool-Aid!" Oh, yeah. All right, so going to just jump on into chapter 8. If you remember what happened in chapter 6 and 7, we have won the war. And the question I want to start with before we get into it is if we all of a sudden decide to pull off and start our own country, we use the example over and over in chapter 6 and 7 is if we were our own classroom and pulled away from the school, well, what if it worked? What do we do then? We're going to need some rules, some things. We're going to have a bunch of topics immediately come up, like how do we handle lunch? How do we handle getting to school? And so that time when all of a sudden you're debating about all these things of how we're going to run a country would be the most vulnerable time a country is going to have. And as soon as we win the war, if we start debating on all this stuff, France could take us over. England could come back and take us over. It could go horribly bad, except for one person. One person on your first slide is Ben Franklin. We've said over and over again in the last chapter, thank you, Ben Franklin, for all the stuff that he came up with. But one thing that he did that is more important than any of it is in 1775. Catch the date. 1775 is when we had the Second Continental Congress and we had the Olive Branch Petition, and we were asking, hey, can we fix this? And they gave a hard no. When they want to watch your insides burn, it's a hard no. And so what happened at that point is the rest of the country and all the people start working on how do we declare independence and what are we going to do to fight the war? Ben Franklin was the only one who thought in his head, hey, if we get this, we're going to need a plan. And he started that exactly. And in 1775, in June, May was the Second Continental Congress, the Olive Branch Petition. By June, he began working on what is going to be called the Articles of Confederation. This was our first form of government, and it's horrible. It was a good try. Ben Franklin is like a lot of people. When they hear a good idea, it sounds good. You try it, you see the holes in it, and then you make it better. That's why we do not have the Articles of Confederation anymore. But first draft, 1775, he begins working on it. Benjamin Franklin working on it by himself. He is actually going to present it finally in 1777, sends it to the Continental Congress. That time it's the Third Continental Congress together and everything as our government at that point. And they begin to look at it. And anytime you make a list of rules or anything, people are going to have debates. And there immediately were problems that came up that we started to have to figure out what we're going to do. One of the first problems that comes up is, what about slavery? Because remember, it was a hot button issue at the time. We wanted to get rid of it, but we can't at that time because the colony's there. So here's the question. How do we count the people? Because if we say that slaves don't count, you're discrediting them as people. But if you say they count 100%, then all of a sudden the states that are importing slaves and stuff, it's literally like buying votes because they could bring in more slaves to give them more representation in Congress. And it would just spiral out of control to where those states, because of buying slaves, would have all the power. And if those states have all the power, we're never going to get rid of slavery. So we're going to go through back and forth. We're going to come up with something called the 3/5 compromise, which is more than half, 3/5. And so that basically says you have to admit they're people. They're more than half right there. But also it doesn't give them a full vote on the representation. So it gives them 3/5. It was a compromise. And that's what we're going to have to do as we begin to work through this. One of the other things that you're going to see, and we're going to talk about these coming up, is what about the states that are like where we're at right now? Because at this point, west of the Appalachian is still part of England. 1775, we haven't even declared independence yet. That's not till 1776. But what do we do about these things? Ben began working on these, trying to figure out, do we make them territories? Do we make them states? Do they secede to another area? What do we do? These are all questions. And once he presents it in 1777, it begins to get into a debate. And that is what goes on for quite a while. It's going to go through 6 drafts before it is finally finalized and everything. It just kept getting worked over. People are going to debate. But the great thing, I want you to catch this again. This is all going on when we're not even a country yet. And so it's so perfect. Once again, this is going to actually pass in the spring of 1781. A Battle of Yorktown is not till October of 1781. So the moment we actually win the last battle, we already had a government in place, ready to go. This is how we're going to handle it. So if it hadn't been for Ben, we would have been in a lot of trouble. So thank you to the Articles of Confederation to him, even though it is flat horrible. I mean, it's like looking at some Sweet Plains dentist thing. It's not pretty. It's not pretty. So when the Articles of Confederation, when you start looking at it, the greatest problem they had was they had such a fear of central authority because they had a king telling them what to do and how to do and all these things. They didn't want that. All they had seen is from the dawn of time, there had been a leader after leader after leader that he said what they do and everybody had to do it. And there was no debate about it. And so we had this total fear of putting one person in charge. So we're actually not going to have a single person in charge. And here's where we start to see the holes in problems. Like I said, some things sound good when you say them. And then once you start to examine it, it's not that great. Having nobody in charge, all of a sudden, when you have a problem, who decides? And so we're going to have a total mess up of the government because they didn't put anybody in charge. They feared their rights that they had fought for, the rights that they had died for, the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom of press. They feared that the king would start taking those rights. And I'm going to tell you right now, anytime you see a leader begin to take your freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, we need to stand up as a nation and demand our rights back, because that's what those men in the last chapter died for, is so that we would have those rights to say what we want, believe what we want, do what we want. And that is straight up America as it gets. America. All right. So they finally ratify it on March 1st of 1781. Ratify means that everybody's going to agree and we approve. Do not get this confused with Ratatouille. That is a Disney movie, or Rats Fried. That's what the corn dogs are in the cafeteria. You didn't know that? You didn't know that's what the rats were? You thought that was a stick. Okay. It's a tail. It's a tail. All right. So, but when they finally get it done, they're going to call it a firm league of friendship. And that's about all it was a bunch of friends trying to be nice to each other. Because let's begin to look on the third slide what the problems were. They had some things that were good and they sound good, but as soon as you start to look at them, they were horrible. They did not work. First off, Congress is going to be the last resort between states' disputes. So if two states get into an argument, if Georgia and Tennessee are having a problem, then it goes to Congress. Congress will debate it. They'll talk about it. But here's the problem. They made a rule that everybody has to agree. To change something in the Articles of Confederation, to add something or make a rule, every state has to agree. Is that ever going to happen? I can't think of a time now that you can take one classroom and everybody agree on something. There will always be somebody who goes against what you believe and what you're wanting. And if we have to make it everybody agree, we might as well just dance around with our hands together, because we're living in a utopia that doesn't exist. And so scared that they would have that one guy that's in charge, we leave it completely off, and we want this all agree. It's never going to happen. If we even were trying to order lunch around the room, we're going to have disagreement on what we got. And just like in the families you have today, what you need to do is majority rule. And we will see our problems in this. And in the next one, we're going to, in the Constitution, add things that have to be 51%, or there's some things that have to be a 66% majority on things like that, depending on what we're changing. All right. So we finally realized that didn't work. It sounded great for the, nobody being in charge. Everybody agreed. Doesn't work. Another thing that was great, maintain the armed forces. We are going to need a government that is in charge of the military. If we had state militias and we go against another country, you would have to have all the states once again agree on the battle plan, and that's not going to happen. You need a centralized authority in the military. Great. This is a great idea, except because of all the things that they had dealt with under the king, of the taxes on sugar, tax on lead, tax on China, tax on, glass, all these things. They didn't have any taxes federal. We're not going to tax federal. That's a state deal. Well, if we don't tax federal, what money do we have to buy guns and pay our soldiers? We have none. And so is there a soldier going to sign up to fight without a gun and with no paycheck? No. And so immediately what happens once they make this, and it sounds so good, and it is good because that's the way we run it today, but we just had to have taxes to back it up. As soon as they do this, every state goes back to militias to protect themselves. And It's not going to work. It's not going to work. The other thing that we had, and the government does this today, these are good ideas, but they did not all jive and fit together, is to print money. Our government prints money today, right? But we have to have the gold to back it up. Quick little illustration so you understand inflation. America has a place called Fort Knox. We keep our gold in Fort Knox. I'm just throwing out numbers. If we have $100 billion worth of gold in Fort Knox, we can print $100 billion worth of money. And so that way our money is worth something. The moment we start making money that doesn't exist, and we're seeing some of that now where we're printing money and we don't have the gold to back it up, inflation kicks in, which means companies are not going to lose money because of this. They will raise the price on everything. I know I went last week to Dairy Queen. It was $10 for the quarter-pound cheeseburger combo. It was a couple weeks ago, $6. It has almost doubled. Dairy Queen was not going to lose money. They were going to pass that on to us is where it happens. And so we're starting to see some of those things where we've printed more money than we have. That is basic economics. And so our government is able to print money, but we have not a thing to back it up. And if we don't have a thing to back it up, our money is absolutely worthless. We're going to talk in the next video and everything about a man who wallpapers his house with money because it was worthless. Been really cool wallpaper, but it was worthless. So we're printing money. The only thing that actually comes good out of this is the last one, a post office, which we hardly use anymore today because of emails and things like that. But the post office is something that continued over, and it was given to the government right here. And I want to explain to you real quick, if you catch this, when we're talking about the post office, the guy who wrote the Articles of Confederation and put all this stuff in here was Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin is the one who, once again, thank you, Ben Franklin, hospitals and libraries and rocking chairs and stoves and all the stuff that enriched our lives. How does he make all his money if he does not patent any of his ideas because he wants us to enjoy them? He makes his money off of the post office and its printing presses. And so what does Ben Franklin do? He literally gives his business that he has, the post office, over to the United States so that they can assimilate news to each other and messages to the people. Ben Franklin literally gives up his jobs and his money, his career, to see America grow. And now it kind of makes more sense why on his tombstone it says Ben Franklin, the first American. He literally gives everything he's got to get us going. And over and over again, as we study through this, you will just have to say, thank you, Ben Franklin. All right. And so go to the next one. The bad, once again, to amend the Articles of Confederation, all states have to agree. That is never going to happen. All states, because of this, want to be sovereign and independent. So once again, they're printing their own money for their state and everything because the money for the government is worthless. So they are printing their own money. They have no authority to tax then. And as the head government, states can tax and states are able to pay for militias. States are able to pay for other things. But when your federal government cannot tax, you're in trouble. Just like today, we have state tax and we have federal tax. They pay for different things. But our original form of government, Articles of Confederation, had no tax as a federal government. Other things that happened is commerce was not regulated. Commerce is interstate trade between each other. And immediately when this happens, it's not regulated. New York was a jerk. And they immediately started charging Connecticut more for their cabbage. They immediately started charging New Jersey more for their firewood so that it would help them. But you're hurting the Connecticut farmers. You're hurting the New Jersey lumberjack. And so immediately we're developing problems in our government because we were not regulating commerce. Commerce today is regulated by the government so that states cannot be rude or mean or disrespect to other states. We have to keep the same. If I do this to New Jersey, I do this to New York. If I do this to that, and it keeps everything running in. Once again, the other thing is no executive branch, and that becomes a problem. So that is the good, the bad.